Telepathic communications, right, and they do that. In many respects, I could say that they're superior to us, even including the bad ones, you say. But the most essential thing which they need for graduation are the very things that we have, and that's why we're so important to them.
We need them, they need us.
Well, yes, in a sense that's right, but they need us more than we need them, you know. For those of us who can walk in love and light and balance and be one with the Creator, we don't need the technology. Now, I'll get back to my main story in a minute about the White Sands, New Mexico incident. But since you brought up a very good point there, I'd like to explain something to you. I've had the privilege of working with two extraterrestrial communities here upon planet Earth. One of them was right here in Arizona, back in the 70s, in the vicinity of Wickenburg here, you know where that is, about 120 miles from here, in the vicinity of a place called Vulture Peak. And I had an ongoing liaison with them. It's in my book back there. I talk about it. Ongoing liaison with them for almost 2 years, maybe a little bit more. And then I had another experience that happened in Northern California. I stayed with that group for about 6 months near the Beale Air Force Base. Anybody know where Beale Air Force Base is? You know where Grass Valley is? Grass Valley. It's not too far from Sacramento, up in that general area, a little place called Rough and Ready. And I had a 6 months tenure with that particular extraterrestrial group. The first group I'm talking about, we had more or less an oppositional relationship, and it's a wonder they didn't kill me, really, because I really walked their dog. And I wasn't afraid of them. I constantly challenged them because I wanted to know more. They were somewhat exasperating to work with because they never gave me anything unless I earned it, you know. And their demeanor towards me was basically like we would treat a dog or a cat. You know, they tolerated me. And but when I made a mark and deserved credit, they gave it to me. Now, what I want to do is go back to something that happened, which goes along with your question. I had asked them how they traveled extraterrestrially. So they came to me in my apartment in Phoenix. I was living in Phoenix at the time one night, and said, "Okay, we want to give you your answer. Sit down." So I sat down. Said, "Take a piece of paper." I did, a pencil. He said, "Now, I want you to draw a circle." I couldn't understand what this had to do with traveling extraterrestrially, but I did as I was bade. And I drew a circle, and they said, "Now draw another circle and overlap it by 50%. And I did. And they said, "Now put a dot in the center of that." And I did. They said, "Now that's how we travel extraterrestrially." I was furious. I said, "What are you doing, playing games with me, you know?" And so I berated them to no small degree, you know. And their message to me, figure it out. Let's see if you can do it. It took me a long time, and I had to wrestle with it. But finally one day I did get it. And it was so simple. And this thing began to make sense to me. This became negative. This became positive. Because we're working now, from their point of view and me, we're working in a world of polarities. So this was the negative aspect. This was the positive aspect. This is the balanced middle or the neutral area where the two overlap, you see. It's neither positive or negative and what have you, so it's neutral. So I realized that, and so what I did then was to remove the polarities, and so there was no more negative, and I removed the positive, so there's no more positive. Now I had a simple vehicle to work with. I had this. Now if you take that and you turn it on its side, you see, which I did, we come up with something that looks spherical and much like a spacecraft, don't we? Now I have the dot here, you see. My mind was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour, you know, to put all this together and figure out what they mean. Finally, I came to the point of realization that if I was to remove this and this, I would have the secret to how they travel extraterrestrially. Now keep bearing in mind these schematics I've given you, because this is how they do travel extraterrestrially. This dot that they told me to put in the center represents the mind. The other is the hardware that, in a sense, surrounds the mind that we see initially in the spherical shape of a UFO. Within the proximity and within the environment of the third dimension, in other words, in our planes of existence, they have to use a vehicle to protect and inure the mind. And so they surround it with energy, which of course is not real energy hardware as we know it, but it is a spacecraft, you see. They remove the limitations of the negative and the positive. They end up with the spacecraft, but the minute that they leave our gravitational field and get out into space, they no longer need the vehicle. They become one with God, their mind, their soul, their heart, and what have you. So that all of this, of course, that was before is now removed, and they are traveling solely with their mind or with spirit. And let's say that their planet is over here someplace. What they do, they contact that synergy on their planet. In other words, their energy and this energy is synergy. And they lock into it with their mind, and they travel through space. They erase all limitations of the speed of sound, the speed of light, and what have you, and they do it with mind. And they do it with spirit. And in truth, most of the planets, of course, are very spiritually oriented, and they revel and talk about the Creator at great length. So true travel extraterrestrially is with mind and soul as opposed to hardware and the way we think it's done. This is why I don't worry too much about some of these lower beings who are amongst us who are still using spacecraft. The Guardian forces, of course, use this methodology to travel through space and to overcome the obstacles of, you might say, imagination or realization. So I learned a great lesson from them at that point, and someday I should write a book on a full term of the experiences I experienced with both of these communities when I went in and visited them, because they were very, very interesting. There was another aspect of your question which I think I missed. What was it?
In terms of dimensionality.
Dimensionality. Okay, and what I'm saying is they overcome dimensions through being one with the Creator source itself. There are no levels of consciousness or dimensions at that point. They use that synergy, the energy of their own planet, the energy of God, to move from point A to point B. And they do it, or they'll do it in a matter of, say, if it's way, way out there, trillions of light years away, they'll do it in a matter of hours, you know. In my book back here, the Armstrong Report, page 83, I think it is, I talk about an incident about the United States and having our own UFO in 1961. It was reported in 1961, wherein we took off from Stead Air Force Base. We passed the moon and were well on our ways to Mars in an hour and a half. The speed of that craft at that time, would you believe, was over 300,000 miles an hour. That's a piece of hardware we had right here in our own United States. Of course, that was an accumulation. That knowledge to get to that point of realization, of course, was based upon what we've been given extraterrestrially, was based upon the Nazi information, some of which I have over there or someplace. I don't know what I did with it. Oh, there, here. So anyhow, that's 1961, and that was the exposure in 1961. But we had, as late as the early 50s, late 40s, we were already well into this, you see. 1948, you know, we took information from that group too. Yes.
Is that the anti-gravity method? Or?
Yeah, it's an anti-gravity, and using some of the principles, of course, as taught by the, not so much the good ETs, but the malefic ETs, extraterrestrials, the ones that do not have our best interests at heart. What happened was that there was a trade-off between the Truman administration and those extraterrestrials who asked us to work with them at that time. And they said that if we asked them for the secrets to travel extraterrestrially, they said to us, if we give it to you, let us use your people as biological research entities. I'll come back to that in a minute, okay? Let's go back to the original scenario, and we're talking again about the White Sands, New Mexico incident. And we have already learned that there were 5 bodies aboard. We know that they were examined and exhumed in depth. But let's go back to the craft itself. What did it look like? The craft itself ended up being 100 foot in diameter. So what it was then was a large scout craft. That's about the largest they have, you see. But believe it or not, some of the craft, the motherships that fly around, you could put hundreds of those in one of the mother craft, you know. One of the biggest I ever saw was in California, working with that second extraterrestrial group that I did. I saw that craft one night as I was going on to Beale Air Force Base to stay overnight. The craft, when it finally exposed itself to me, was no less than 50 miles long, and I'd say somewhere between 12 and 15 miles high. Now that's one big mother. And it was there in all that immensity. It was, and it's the mother ship, the control ship for the whole West Coast, whether it be Washington, Oregon, California, what have you. It controls that whole region. The extraterrestrial community I went in with later on was one of their communities in the vicinity of Beale Air Force Base. Some very, very nerdy things going on there, which of course were very sophisticated weaponry system. And they were monitoring it through an extraterrestrial community here on Earth at the time. I won't have time to talk about it today, but it is briefly mentioned again in my book back there. Okay, so the craft was 100 foot in diameter, and there was a question, how do we get it back to Wright-Patterson? Because they wanted it back there to examine it leisurely, you see, and it was in the way sitting in the proving grounds of New Mexico, White Sands. So there was 2 options. One, they could ignore it and bury it on site. That was considered. Or they could take it overland by night and take a matter of months and finally get it back to Wright-Patterson. Well, they chose the second alternative. And without a doubt, if ever I was to pin an accolade upon the American government and pin a star or whatever on them, that would be it. Because that was a monumental job to move that silly thing from New Mexico at night all the way back to Wright-Patterson, Ohio. But that was a monumental feat. But they did it. Now, they did it with some consequence. For instance, what they would do, they had to divert all traffic. They had to take down power lines. They had to use farmlands. Many of the old farmers became rich overnight, you know. And they would tell them, if you'll let us use your farmland, and we'll pay you X amount of dollars, you know, and you can retire, but you must keep your mouth shut, you know. And these old farmers, you know, Mom and Dad and apple pie, they did it, and it became history later on. But they successfully moved that silly thing all the way back in about 6 months' time. Now, an interesting aspect, I met a man here, of all places, he's over in Verde Valley, who was a, if you can get this, he was a, what is it, denim? Is that the, what's the old blue jeans they used to sell that was so popular? Was that denim? Yeah. He was a denim salesman, and he was in Colorado at the time, sitting in a hotel that I know called the Antlers Hotel in what name is that, Colorado City? Durango. No, not Durango. It's the it's where the Air Force Academy is. Now, Colorado. What is it? Colorado Springs, right. He was there. And so he was sitting at the bar, leisurely relaxing after a long day, and this young captain came in and sat down next to him and ordered a drink himself. And they had a couple of drinks, and captain said to him, he said, do you believe in extraterrestrial beings and objects and things like that? So the guy I'm talking about said, yes, I do. He says, I've always believed in it. He says, so do I. So the conversation went on, a couple more drinks, and then this young man unloaded on him that he had in his possession at that time as responsible for the moving of an object, extraterrestrial nature, a spacecraft, if you will, the same one I'm talking about now. He was moving that thing, and he said the most unusual thing happened. Now here's something that's really important to point out, that all spacecraft are not hardware or materialistic. Ours are. So are the Soviets, now the Russians and others, South Africa and others who have craft. They are of so-called sum and substance. But extraterrestrial craft are not hardware, and they are not materialistic. They are mind, M-I-N-D. They can take on the form and the shape of materiality or hardware, but indeed they are not. In this incident that they were talking about, the young man underestimated the height of a bridge, and he had this craft on a lowboy. And in going under this object, I think it was a bridge, anyhow, it didn't fit, and the whole top caved in. Now, you can imagine how he felt as a young captain. That was court-martial for sure. And he was panicked. What happened was they had to pull off the road before daybreak, and they pulled into a wooded area, and they went to sleep. When they woke up, that craft was totally intact. There wasn't a dent, a mar, or burnish or anything on it. It was perfectly in a normal state once again. It had healed itself, or something had healed it overnight. And, of course, the indications were, and this is why he was probing, he said to this man that I'm referring to, he says, I suspect that it has a biological intelligence, and that we think that it actually healed itself overnight. Well, he was right on, because many of the spacecraft that we see have biological intelligence. They're not real. They take on the form and shape of hardware to interface with us in a form and shape which we can accept and believe. But they are something else. They are mind, M-I-N-D. Now, it was an interesting thing about that craft before it left the site. How do we get it back to Wright-Patterson? So the object was, well, now, let me tell you this. In 1948, the largest craft we had would go about from here to the wall over there in width. That was a C-54, which was considered then a big craft. You can't put an object 100 foot into something like this. So what was the solution? Well, the solution was to cut it up into segments, label it, and reassemble it once they got it back to Wright-Patterson, you see. So they said, okay, that's what we'll do. Well, they got an acetylene torch, and they tried to cut this silly thing up. Guess what? It didn't work. I mean, they could burn all day, and it wouldn't budge one iota. Later on, they conducted tests with it. With a 16-pound sledgehammer, they would hit it just as hard as they could, and the 16-inch sledgehammer would bounce off like it was nothing, you know. Nor would it burnish, nor would it mar, nor would it scar, nor would it dent. Resilient, totally resilient. Then they put 10 200-pound men on the surface up and had them jump up and down in one place to see if they could bend it and dent it. Wouldn't do it. The surface of that craft later on turned out to be less, again, like the flight suits those little guys were wearing, turned out to be less than the thickness of a common everyday newspaper page. And yet it was impervious to being cut and what have you. Now, I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I know they got it back to Wright-Patterson, and it's still there someplace in a hangar, particularly constructed for it, as they have others, and it's still under observation. We learned a great deal, of course, from that particular craft. The United States, of course, is without a doubt the foremost authority when it comes to the Earth itself, into their awareness, technologically, of course, of what we would call a spacecraft. We had our last capture, the last one I was aware of and really in on, and I try to stay abreast of these things. I lecture internationally on these things, you know. I have 2 conferences this year. I have one in Iceland. That's going to be a real interesting one because they're having every day, broad daylight activity in Iceland. And they're coming in and out of a particular iceberg up there, and they promised to take us in after the convention. There's 10 speakers from all over the world appearing there, and I happen to be fortunate enough to be one of them. And I got another big UFO conference, which I'll be speaking at in Tromsø, Norway this year. So I tried to, you know, since I speak at these large affairs and so forth, I keep my ears glued to the ground. I talk to my contemporaries and so forth and find out what the latest is in terms of the state of the art. Much of it, though, I have an advantage over them. I can intuit things, and I can come up with information they don't have. Even the government can't hide things from me because I can plug in and I know what they're doing. Much of it I don't talk about, and I think it's needless to talk about it. And it's really none of my business, nor is it any of your business at this point. Your business is to walk with love and light and with God, and as I said, the rest will take care of itself. Yes?
What's the purpose of a craft if they can travel by mind, and if their purpose is to overtake us or whatever, why not just never expose themselves and do it through the mind?
Because we are in a different frame of reference than other people are, you know. We have to experience it physically. We're in the third dimension.
We do, but if
Yeah.
they overtake us, they can just do it with mind control.
Well, they do it with mind control. For instance, you're being interfaced with every day in your dream states, and of course in your state of physicality, you're being interacted with by them. They do it through the forms of abductions, they do it through contactees, they do it through mind in many other ways. The one thing that they will not interfere with, I'm talking about now the guardian or good forces, is your free will. It's the most sacred thing there is in all God's universe, and they're not about to interfere with that. They will subliminally influence you, hopefully, to respond in a given manner. And as I spoke later on, using different instrumentation, now you, the ultimate instrument they're using now to influence what is to happen upon the planet.
Do they use the material spaceship as a fear tactic?
Do they use what?
The spaceship as a fear tactic? If we
It's a
see
fear
it,
tactic?
that we will fear them?
No, that's not their intention. Their intention is, of course, to call our attention to the fact that they are there, you know. And they've always been there. What's happening at this point is that as we raise our consciousness, they've always been there before. We just haven't noted them. Yeah, the good ones and the bad ones. We're beginning to perceive them. There's a big question when you see a craft. Who does it belong to? Does it belong to the government? Does it belong to the good or guardian forces? Or does it belong to the baddies, you say? You have to use a great deal of discretion and discrimination to get involved with these, you know. Now, the ultimate that you use if you wish to identify one of them is right here. If this says, ugh, I don't like him, you better believe it and you better get out of there, because this never lies, this does. You know, you get into intelligence many times makes us fools. If this speaks, though, the subconscious or the intuitive or anything down here in the solar plexus, and incidentally, right here, as well as up here, you have gray matter. And that gray matter is about the size, maybe a little bit smaller than a baseball. In here is stored everything that you have ever done, the remembrances of it. And I see Joshua shaking his head over here. And it's a little known, of course, medical fact. Many of them know it, but they don't tell you and I. When that resonates and says, you better get out of there, you better listen to it and do it. If it says, oh, it feels so good, and I think I like it, it's telling you the truth, you know. So follow that, and you can never go wrong in terms of identification of these objects that you come into that are extraterrestrial in nature. Yes?
Talking about these beings being of mind, they travel with the mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when they get to this earth plane, do they then materialize in some material form so we recognize them?
Yes, material.
Or what about these dead ones? Were they still materializing in
They went through.
Even though they were dead?
Yeah, they were interesting enough. When they were on our level of consciousness and environment, they went through the same rigors of death that we do. In other words, there was decomposition. The picture that is most common throughout the world right now. Huh?
Even though they went through the whole physical.
Well, the essence, spirit, and what have you was withdrawn from that body, and the body became basically corporeal in nature, because at that time they were in a state of corporeality and consciousness, so they were subject to the laws of our planet, you know.
Okay,
And
so why couldn't they, if they were mind, why couldn't they create a body that had all of the eyes and ears?
well, they originally had that. Maybe you lost me. I said they went from that into what they are today. Now, there's another interesting aspect to all this, and I discovered, I guess I have to tell you the story. Some years ago, there's a man by the name of Frank Barron Kowski. He's in Phoenix. And I don't know why. Frank is always setting me up. He doesn't like me. And so he periodically is having me come down to Phoenix, and I would talk to large groups that he had put together. And his obvious intent was always to discredit me. And this is nothing unusual because I have this, you know, I did for a long time. Anymore I don't. I'm accepted as an authority on the subject, and I don't receive contentious behavior anymore. I wouldn't care if I did. You know, I know who I am, and I know my truth, and I will stick to my the responsibilities and the understandings I have. But in this case, Frank called me down, and I talked for some time. And he said, may I interrupt? And I said, yes, sure. He said, well, he says, I have two people in the audience that I'd like to bring up here to double check that what you're saying. Do I have your permission? This is unheard of. But what could I say? If I'm an authority and I know what I'm talking about, why should I fear somebody else? So I said, yes, bring them up to the stage. And they did. Turned out to be one of the former astronauts, Brian O'Leary, and the local head of the UFO chapter in Phoenix. Both of them called up to the stage. So I began to talk, and Brian O'Leary finally was the one who stood up, and he says, look, I don't know what the hell we're doing up here, but this man knows what he's talking about, and I'm not going to waste his time or mine staying up here. Listen to this. Let him alone. So they went down off the stage and left, and I thought it was over. And so I get well into it again. I'm just getting into swing, and Frank says, well, I've got something else I'd like to bring up here. May I do that? And, well, so what are you going to say? You know, no? Are you going to say, well, bring him along? So I said, all right, bring him up. Turned out to be an abductee, a man who was a retired aeronautical engineer, and his wife. He was abducted in broad daylight in a parking lot of a shopping mall, in the presence and sight of his wife. Was taken out and was gone for hours, and finally, of course, he was reintroduced back into Earth in an altered state. So the object then that I was to debrief this man in front of the whole audience, which I did, you know. And I began to deal with him. And all the time that I'm working with him, he's crying. Oh my God, he cried over and over again. The abuse that he went through and the experiences of it all was traumatic. And he couldn't just carry on a normal conversation. It was difficult for him to do. I remember specifically after I had interrogated him to a very deep depth and so forth, and we'd gotten a lot of information out of him, I said to him, because I was concerned, I said, Frank, or whatever his name was, let's say Frank, would you allow somebody here on Earth to do to you what they did to you on that ship? And he said, certainly not. I said, then how can you condone what they did to you upon the craft? I don't know, but I just don't feel they know what they're doing, or if they do, then of course it's for my best interest and good. And I said to him, well, how can you make this differential, you know? You allow one to do it, and you say you won't allow it here on Earth. And he says, well, I just don't know. Well, at that point, he began to cry very deeply and upset, and I had to wait till he got control again. And so I began to ease out of this whole thing because it was getting too traumatic. But we got to the very end, and I said, Frank, I said, is there anything that you haven't covered that you think would be of prime interest to the people here today? I want you to think for a moment of one thing that you could possibly bring forth. And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, there was. There is something I'd like to say. And I said, good. He said, while they had me on the table in this abduction state, and while they were examining me, just before they started, a human being walked in. I said, do you mean like us, a human being? He said, yes, like us. I said, describe him. He said he was about a little under 6 foot, I would judge. He had brown hair and blue eyes, fair complected. Get this, he was wearing a B-15 flight jacket. And he was obviously somebody of note, because when he walked in, all the grays almost snapped to attention, you know, and stood back so he could look at Frank on the table. And he went over and he looked down at Frank, you know, and nodded his head to the grays, and, well, it looks pretty good to me. And he turned around, and at the foot of the bed that they had Frank lying on the floor was a valve of some kind. He didn't know what it was for. But this individual, this humanoid, actually reached down and adjusted that valve, and then he rose up again, he looked at Frank, he smiled at the Greys, and he left. Now, I always suspected that behind the Greys there was another force. And I always suspected that it was humanoid in nature. Not to say that it's human like us, that it has emotions, it's capable of love, or all the things that we are, but it's human looking like. And sure enough, he corroborated that day, that the Greys, their masters, are actually human-like. Now, maybe they're hybrids that they've been successful in creating, you know. Or, here's a thought. Maybe we have in our own government or world government those who now have reached the state that they can master these extraterrestrials such as the Zeta Reticuli types. And that indeed we are the superior ones and they're working for us rather than us working for them. Sort of a mind-boggling possibility. And it certainly is there. And I don't pursue it any further than that, but I throw it open to you as a possible option to think about. Certainly one of the two. It was a hybrid human who looked very much like us, or it was actually a human who is now working conjointly with the so-called malefic ETs. It's a thought. Okay. What else do I want to cover on that? Well, that's basically it. In other words, the White Sands, New Mexico, that's the basics to it, and that's how I got introduced into, and there is another aspect maybe I should bring in. So my first incident involving UFOs per se was in 1948. Now, it was classified top secret and above, really. You could say above top secret. At the same time, there was a little magazine that had just come out and was brand new called Cornet magazine, a little book that looks about the size of Fate. And they scooped that White Sands, New Mexico incident, and they put it in storybook form and published it in a sensational article in the Cornet magazine. 1 minute it was highly classified, the next minute it was on the newsstands in a presentation that was fairy tale-like. We, as young soldiers, all went out and bought copies of it, took it home to our wives and so forth, and it became the topic of discussion for all of that area, you know. 2 days later, they were told by the government, you either cease and desist and get those things off of the newsstand, every one of them, or we'll bankrupt you. And they did, of course. In the meantime, we all had personal copies of this. A blanket order went out to each and all of us. Anybody who had that, they must turn it in immediately under the threat of court-martial. So I had to, of course, retract my copy, and I did turn it in, but I didn't turn it in without resistance. I said to my commanding officer at that point, I said, why aren't we telling the American people this? Why are we hiding these things? I said, it's already out. They've read it, you know. Why are you trying to cover up? Well, the first response was, it's none of your business. You'll do as you're told. You know, he's a colonel and I'm a captain, and so it was an order. And I still was resistant, and he saw it. And I was bucking him. And he says, all right. He says, I'll tell you why. He said, we do not wish to experience once again an Orson Welles scares such as the one he perpetrated in the invasion from Mars. Well, you know, it made some sense in those days. But the unfortunate part about it was that became catch-22. And from that time on, it was always in the interest of the people not to give them this information because they might panic. And then, of course, as a nation of peoples, we'd be in deep trouble. Well, we know that they've long overdone it. I can assure you, and this is me saying this, that sometime this year, probably in the fall or maybe midsummer, we're going to have mass showings throughout the world. It's going to happen. 1993 is numerologically is a 22-4 master year. And everything in our creation and existence is going to be accentuated. The bad is going to be tougher, the good is going to be greater, because it's a master year. And that also means that phenomenal things are going to happen in our consciousness. And part of those phenomenal things that are going to happen in our consciousness will have to do with UFOs or ETs, and we're going to see it. The government, unless they step forward and begin to level with we the people, they're going to end up with egg on their face. It all began in December of 1991, when over Brussels, Belgium, 60-some-odd craft appeared in broad daylight, and for 24 hours stayed there. And of course, it's common rote and fact that everybody in the Belgian society, including the premier, including the policeman, the soldier, the man on the street, and everybody, every one of them swears to this day that this thing happened. You can't dissuade them to change their minds. They all saw it. Yes, sir.
What then would be the relationship between the UFOs and the crop circle?
And the what?
Is there a relation between the UFO and the crop circle that happened?
Oh, there's a message in the crop circle phenomena, and they already have the solution, but again, they're not telling us. The interesting side of that is that when it first appeared, it was poo-pooed, as we all know. It still is to some degree today. But what happened in England is they began to appear on parliamentary land. And what most people don't know is that Parliament owns a lot of real estate, you know. So these things began to appear on parliamentary land, and they had to take a look at it. Finally, they said, well, what we'll do, we'll solve the problem and the mystery. They called in physicists and scientists and other people in the know, and they began an in-depth study on these geometric formations of the crop circles. Now, I got this from Tony Dodd, a good friend of mine, of course, who's in the field of ufology in England. And the bottom line, he gave it to me in confidence. He said the bottom line in the decipherization of all those things, there was one basic message. Get ready, we're coming. Get ready, we're coming. This again is why I say that we will soon have mass expositions of craft. We're going to see it, you know, and they are coming. There are things, incidentally too, they're already appearing in Russia. Not so much here, but they're appearing in broad daylight there. I talked to some of my Soviet contemporaries, and some of the stories they tell me are mind-boggling. One of the latest, when I was in Berlin, and I was talking to some of my Russian friends, is that they are now entering the school system. And they're teaching the children what we call new math and new understandings of science, saying that ours is all kooky, you know. And so what happened is the children are of a like consciousness, regardless of their age, or a like consciousness. They can see the individual who is teaching them, and he writes on the board and teaches them the new math and what have you. Most of the school teachers can't see it. All they can see is the writing on the board, which is rather spooky, you know. And some of the teachers now have gotten to the point where they can actually perceive the individual writing this too. And they're extraterrestrials who are actually teaching the Russian children principles of mathematics and things which, of course, are unusual in nature to ours. So there's and you would say, well, why don't they do it here in the United States? For the life of me, I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the United States is such a laggard when it comes to acknowledgement that they exist and to give us the truth. They don't do it. Russia is totally open to it. Some years ago, 3 years ago, in the Frankfurt conference, which I, again, was a principal speaker, they brought out stories of bitter relationships with the children and ETs and UFOs. And they brought forth the accounts of the children, what they saw and what happened when they were taken aboard the craft. And incidentally, none of them were harmed. And they came back and related the experiences, which were loving in nature, with the craft that they had had interaction with. You might say that Russia, believe it or not, or than the former Soviet Union, is more spiritual than we are. You see, our astrological sign is Cancer. Their astrological sign is Scorpio. And Cancer has a propensity, so to speak, of being big mother, you know, controlling everything, and as we do. And they're very perceptive, they're very intuitive, they're very all things that a Cancerian is. But the Russians have a greater credibility in that they can believe in the phenomena, whereas many times we do not. We're resistant to it, you know, unless we can control it. The Russians are open to it, and they will accommodate it. And I think that's the difference between the two nations. The other thing is, being a Scorpio, the Russians have the ability to perceive spiritual things, but they can't bring it to a final resolution in terms of reality. We as Cancerian, we can, and we do. So this is why we always remain the dominant power in the world, you see, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union or Russia. And I don't think sometimes, I don't think that we do others, including ourselves, credit in terms of extraterrestrial intervention or reality. Okay. Now, what do we want to go from here? What would you like to hear from here? What would be of interest? Getting the Nazis and a few other things? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to touch on your experience in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
You were over there 3 times. I wonder why. I wonder if there was any UFO activity over there while you were there.
Bundles of it, always. And again, it was beyond top secret. There isn't any war that takes place that there isn't mass showings of UFOs and intervention in a sense. And it turns out that Vietnam was one of the most intense we've ever had. And it's a little talked about, but you'll find it in government files, highly classified. Now, what happens is we're not looking at the good ETs primarily, we're looking at the malefic ETs because they want the bodies. For instance, the blood and the enzymes and all the things that they could use for biological research or the creation of a hybrid human and so forth. What a better place to get it than right there in the battlefield, you know. Thumbs up for the first corpse they can get and what have you. And they did it. But they've done it in every war, not just the Vietnamese War. You know, the Second World War was full of it. Exactly. And speaking of Hitler, there's a very interesting story there, which I should relate, I guess, as I'm jumping from one to the other. In the Second World War, of course, we won it, but we feared in the last months of the war itself that we were going to lose it. Because Hitler kept telling the Allied forces in messages that he had a secret weapon. And we laughed, we didn't believe him. And of course, about that time, he was firing the V-2 rockets into England, you see. They were so inaccurate. They weren't hitting targets. They was sort of to whom it may concern. And inadvertently, they wiped out large amounts of cities and peoples and so forth. If their target was a city the size of London, they might hit it, you know. And so the Allied forces, of course, laughed when he said he had a secret weapon because they assumed it was the V-2 rocket. What we didn't know is that they had a state-of-the-art, and more of these documents are now being placed in my hands. This was handed to me at a Skywatch. This dates back to 1939, when a man by the name of Dr. Professor Phillips had already created a spacecraft wherein he had been to the moon and Mars and Venus and other places, so that when Hitler came into vogue and power and so forth, they wanted this man to work with them. And he says, no way. Obviously, they got some of these technology, but most of what he received, or they received, I should say, was from the malefic ETs. They came into the Second World War through Hitler and the Third Reich. And just as they did with the United States government, they approached him and said, look, I'll tell you what, I will give you the technology and the weapons to win this war if you let me use your people as biological research entities. Well, Hitler, you know, was a nut when it came to Aryan energy. And I have to say this for him, he said, the German people are pure. I will not let you use them, but you can help yourself to everybody I have in prison, Auschwitz and all the others. The Jews, the Poles, the Russians, and all those who were in there in captivity. He said, carte blanche, go help yourself. Now, there's an interesting aside there. Allegedly, 6 million people disappeared from those prison camps. What's not known is at the end of the war, an investigatory commission was commissioned to go in there and actually examine the remains, which was in the form of ashes, of those who had been incinerated or lost. They came up with the possibility of 600,000 as opposed to 6 million. Now that's a far cry from 6 million. And the question is, what happened to the other 5.4 million people? I just told you what happened to them. Hitler made a pact with the Greys, with these malefic ETs, and those people went to them for biological research entity, or spare parts, if you will. The ones who were truly incinerated, the ashes were there, and it was 600,000. I come down on the German people all the time and said, how long are you going to carry this unnecessary cross? The young people today, I said, damn it, you didn't do it. Your grandfather did it, your father did it, what have you, but it's not your guilt. You must not take on the blame anymore. You must stop paying reparations. Now get this, paying reparations to Israel. Germany annually is still paying reparations to Israel for what they did in the Second World War. It's unconscionable, you know. And so I raise Cain about it and tell these young people in Germany that you have to divest yourself of this guilt. It's not your guilt, you know. So, but to go back now to our story. Incidentally, that came out, I was being interviewed by the National Finnish TV in Munich. I think it was, what, 2 years ago when I was lecturing there. And they approached me and wanted to interview me and put me on the Finnish National TV, which I did appear on. And they asked a question about Hitler and the prison camps and the ETs. Was there any connection? And out of my mouth came this statement. Again, as I said earlier, sometimes something comes out of my mouth. I have no idea that it's going to be said. And when I say it, I said, where did that come from? That's exactly what happened at that time. And boy, I'll tell you what, it sent a rocket around the world when I said that, and opened up a lot of inquiries about what actually happened to the 6 million people. And as I said, the only explanation is that that 5.4 million went to the extraterrestrials. Now let's go back to the scenario of the offer that they made to Hitler. Hitler said, no, you cannot use my people, but you can use the people in prison. For that, they said, we will give you the technology to win the war. Now, this was found out by an American intelligence agent. He stumbled on it in a document, a captured document. And in the document, it said that Hitler already had a prototype up and going that was like an extraterrestrial craft. It was a spacecraft that was capable of 1,250 miles an hour. It was capable of vertical takeoff. It was capable of instantaneous 90-degree turns. Now, you're speaking of an ET craft when you speak of something like this. Now, that was a prototype. He had another one on the drawing board, soon to come off. In fact, it came off before the end of the war came. That was capable of doing twice that. It was capable of doing 2,500 and some miles an hour. It was capable of vertical takeoff, 90-degree turns, plus it had a laser weapon aboard that was capable of penetrating 2 to 3 inches of armor. Now, there wasn't a tank that we had that wasn't susceptible then to that type of energy. They could have knocked out every tank we had. They can knock out our battleships and everything else, because that laser weapon would puncture any and all of it. Now, this is the point that the Allied powers become increasingly scared, you know, and they had to be, because they came to the realization that indeed he did have a secret weapon, and if he ever got it up and going, after all the millions of dollars we had spent, the thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people we had lost in the war, we're going to lose it. So, the decision was made at that time to bring this guy at all costs to his knees. And this is what we saw in the bombardment. And I see it today when I'm over there. The remnants, the Germans have kept some of these as institutions and monuments of the Second World War. You can see all the devastation, particularly in Berlin. And so we decided at that time that we had to pull all stops and stop him at all costs. This is why the mass bombings took place. We bombed these airfields, we bombed these railroads, we bombed these factories, the oil fields, Kowski oil field, and anything that was sustaining to his economy or to his industry had to be destroyed. Ball bearing factories and all this. Later, I had the privilege as a photo interpretation analyst in and across their naval base to study these photographs. The devastation that we committed upon them was just catastrophic, really. Now, the point was that we were successful in doing this and causing him to capitulate. And if we hadn't done that, Hitler would have won the war. The Third Reich would have won the war within given 2 months' time more, 2 additional months, he would have won the war. As it was, just as immediately as we won that war, there was a mass push to get into Berlin, number one, to get these 2 craft which he had created, and number 2, to get the personnel who were responsible for the building of it. The Allied forces, of course, consisted of the Russians, then the Soviet Union, the Americans, and the British, and then some of the other subsidiary forces. The 3 major forces, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, all made end runs for Berlin in hopes of getting there first and capturing the documents and the personnel that were responsible for building this craft. As it was, through our own dalliance and ineptness and so forth, the Soviets got there first. And they got most of the documents. But we got there secondly, and we got most of the personnel and what was remaining of the documents, which turned out to be very apropos to what we needed. That's where the American space program started. What we know today as NASA was originally manned by those scientists and physicists that we actually captured during that Berlin excursion, you see. And that was also, this is phenomenal to believe, but it was also the beginning of what we know today as the CIA. That was headed up by German officers in the very beginning. Yes?
Is that the reason why the Russians beat us in the space program when they launched Sputnik in 1957?
Yeah, they were on the moon before we were. And it was through that technology that they got, of course, from the Germans at that time. I think we could have been there almost concomitantly with them, but we were a little bit, we didn't have the resources that they did, so they managed to get there a little before we did. But the other thing, though, you have to remember this too, that behind the scenes, the United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, were never enemies. They were working on getting to the moon conjointly, and whoever could get there first was okay with one or the other, you see. There was no hostility. The moon, of course, there's a book right here, which is a most interesting book. It's long out of print, but it's called Alternative 3. Anybody ever read it? Phenomenal book. It's in my library. I just brought it today to show you. And the object to getting to the moon was based upon this book. The Earth is dying. The Earth is expected by the year 2000, unless we can do something about the ozone layer and what have you, to become defunct, you know. Because through our avarice and greed and our shall we say, inability to deal with things in balance, particularly our ecology, we are facing devastation through environmental factors. That was long recognized back in the 40s and the 50s. And the object was, what do we do in case of? 3 alternatives, of course, were presented. One of them was, of course, to leave the planet and find another planet that we could go to in the event this one was destroyed. The other one was to go deep into our own planet underground, subterraneanly, and set up societies and cities and so forth under the ground. And the third, of course, was to exist as we are and face a demise later on. So we had the 3 alternatives. What we did ultimately as a priority, we accepted and adopted alternative 3, which was going to the moon, another planet. I put them in reverse order, 1, so forth, but that was the number 1 priority. The second priority was to go underground with underground facilities, such as we have out here. And in the event of nuclear attack and in the event of the catastrophic conditions of the deterioration of the ozone layer, we could survive underground. Now, both of these options are in full commitment at this point. We are on the moon. We have been on the moon since the late 40s and early 50s. My tape's back there. I think if you want something very interesting and mind-blowing in a sense, get the tape back there, what NASA didn't tell us about the moon when I talk about this. The other thing in terms of, where do I want to go with that? Well, you had a question. Maybe that was it. Go ahead.
I was just wondering about, we pretty well labeled the moon as far as real estate. How do the Russians feel about that?
The moon itself, as you will hear me say in the tape back there, is not a piece of, although it's a real estate in the consideration of, say, the Soviet Union, Russia, and ourselves, it's a place of escape in the event that we can no longer habitate planet Earth. That's the express purpose of it. But what they're not telling you is that the moon, number one, is a spacecraft. The moon itself was actually flown into the proximity of where it is right now and serves a very, very explicit purpose. It is controlled by extraterrestrials. The group that I work with in the Wickenburg area for 2 years or better told me, I got all this information in the 70s that later came out in the 90s, that the moon, number one, is hollow. Number two, there are 3 extraterrestrial civilizations that live within the moon. And number 3, they are using it for their own purposes, you know, in terms of us and I suppose other things within the solar system. What they didn't tell you, what NASA didn't tell you, and again it's in that book, as they flew around on the dark side of the moon, they discovered that there was vegetation, that there's water, there was lakes and what have you, rivers. And one of the things that was most astronomical in discovery was the fact that there was a huge fan device back there. There was something like a mile across, you know, with giant blaze in it. And this silly thing was obviously designed to bring fresh air into the moon itself, you know, to expiate the old air and to exhaust the new air, exhaust the old, bring in the new. They didn't tell you, too, that they had encounters with extraterrestrials while they were on the moon. There was one particular incident, it's right on TV, or you could see it on TV, where the moon buggy was actually bombarded by a craft and they shot off a fender, you know. There were several astronauts, too, 2 of them, one of them is dead and one of them still living, who talked about the extraterrestrial experiences they had on the moon. One is Buzz Aldrin, now Admiral Aldrin, retired, who went berserk for a while and they couldn't shut him up, and he revealed many of the things that were classified in terms of military or government secrets about the moon. Finally, they shut him up by saying, if you don't shut up, we're going to take your retirement away, and many other threatening things. And of course, the ultimate would be to eliminate him. A predecessor of his by the name of Roden, of course, was not controllable, and he wouldn't shut up, and he did end up dead. Again, he's mentioned in the book Alternative 3. And so through these men, we learned a lot of what was going on on the moon about the conjoint relationship that the United States and the Soviet Union had at that time on the moon as a piece of real estate. And the design was a place to go in the event that Earth was destroyed by nuclear attack or through the decomposition of the ozone line. Yes, Doris?
Isn't the moon supposed to be, the dark side supposed to be about 2,000 degrees below zero, no atmosphere and all that?
How could it be if we got vegetation and water and things like that? Yeah. No, they've been lying to us. Actually, they don't need all the apparatus that they wear on the surface of the moon either. The surface of the moon has oxygen. It looks very much like this. That second, all the showings that we had was subsequent to actually being on the moon. We were already on the moon years and years and years before we had the first landing that was public in nature.
So all this stuff you learned when you were a kid in school is all malarkey.
Yeah, yeah, they were lying to us. You see, there's a government and there's a shadow government. The shadow government doesn't tell the government what it's doing. And so all these secret programs were taking place with, and it's interesting to note that much of the funding for these extraterrestrial, not extraterrestrial, but extracurricular activity is coming from drug money, you know. And that's where it's going. It's going into the secret government, along with your taxes, of course. And so we've been on the moon. Now, incidentally, before I close that off, it took the Russians, the Russian Academy of Sciences, a very prestigious body, of course, in the Soviet Union, now Russia. And they were the one, 2 of their scientists and physicists stepped forward and said there's only one explanation for the moon. Number one, it doesn't belong in our solar system. Number two, it can only be a spacecraft and was driven into the proximity of the Earth. Well, I'd learned this, number one, from the Indians, and then I'd learned this from the extraterrestrial group that I worked with in the Wickenburg area back in the 70s. And then to see these scientists in Russia come out with this proclamation, you know, was really enriching and endearing to my heart, because I had been saying it for years in advance of that. Was there a question there?
Yes, I was curious as to, your spiritual journey, in the transformation from military life to civilian life, there was a shift in consciousness in your own life in that aspect.
That happened through the Kundalini. And it's something that I don't fully understand even to this day. My Kundalini came up, and of course it changed me from what I was into what I am. And it almost killed me. It came up the wrong way. I knew there was no such thing as Kundalini. I didn't know about it, you know. I didn't know what was happening to me. I was a successful businessman on the East Coast, Tampa, Florida, when this actually took place. And I had a very difficult time dealing with it because the reality that I knew was totally changed overnight. All of a sudden, I had the ability to see auras around people. I called it a light then. I could read their minds. I could astral travel. I could do all these things. And I have to tell you, it was very spooky for me. Okay, as I always do before I start again, any questions on any of the segments? Yeah, all right. Yeah.
The two prototypes, German prototypes that could go over 1,000 and over 2,000 miles an hour, etc. What happened to those prototypes?
Okay, that's an interesting story, and I guess I should tell that because it's part of the Second World War scenario. Let's go back to where I left off with that number two, that the Russians and the Americans got most of it, and they began to work conjointly. And the question was, what happened to the two craft that, of course, he had up and going? When Hitler saw that indeed he was going to lose the war, and he was convinced, of course, by those around him in the Third Reich, particularly the SS, and that they better bug out of there, that's exactly what they did. They dismantled the two craft, they put them aboard 3 submarines, and they escaped just before the Allied powers closed in and took over Germany. And those 3 craft spent 6 months at sea, mostly under, and ended up in Argentina. And Hitler, of course, was let up in Argentina, and as I told you earlier, he lasted out his last days there. The 2 craft, along with elements of the SS, were taken into Antarctica, and a place called, it belongs to Sweden, it did, not anymore, but it's called, it's named after Queen Maud, and the name of the place is Queen Maud's Land. And they went in there and established a base in there, a redoubt area, and set up another SS operation. Now, they did that in concert with the extraterrestrials. They had full access to the state-of-the-art of the extraterrestrial technology. What happened was, some years later, 1945, the war ended in August, we then decided that they were a definite threat to the world, and particularly to the United States, because of what the knowledge they had and the technology they had and so forth. I'm sorry, dear. You're a good sneaker, I'll say that. It was decided by the Allied powers in general, and particularly the United States, that we must go in there and evict them, and we also wanted the spacecraft. We wanted them very, very bad, you know.
The United States knew they were there.
Oh, sure they did. Yeah, we knew the whole scenario, and we found it out through our own intelligence later on. So what we did, we had a man who had been into the Hollow Earth, a man of some renown. He was an admiral, Admiral Byrd. And Admiral Byrd had retired, and so what we did, we recommissioned him, called him back to active duty, and commissioned him to go down there and dig out the SS factors in Queen Maud's Land. They gave him 8 months to do it, They gave him unlimited resources in terms of planes and ships and all support resources he needed. At the end of 8 weeks, 2 months, he was totally defeated, Byrd was. Because the Germans in there and the extraterrestrials, the state of technology they had, was so far superior to our own, there was no way that we could hope to take them. Now, this whole thing was being orchestrated and controlled basically by the extraterrestrials. The Nazis, of course, were a part of it. As an example, aircraft would be flying along, you know, in a harmless state and so forth, and finally they'd come up against an invisible barrier and explode and disintegrate. They were using psychotronics to the extent that the overland troops, as they would go in to attack the target, would be subject to psychotronics, and it would drive them crazy, or their heads, even to the point that their heads would explode. I mean, it was hideous what was happening to all of the armed forces down there. And finally, it was Byrd who said, you know, it's inhuman, I can't do it, and we have to say it's impossible. So Byrd then informed the Allied powers that these people were far beyond us in technology and mentality, and that we would have to let them go. Now, they are what I call, we have what I call a Mexican standoff with those peoples at this point in time. First of all, they're in Antarctica, which of course is a large ice mass. And if we were to go in there and drop a bomb on them, nuclear in nature and what have you, we would break all that loose. And ecologically, we would probably flip our axis, you see, because of the disorientation and the weight shift in terms of what we would do with a nuclear attack. At this time, the United States government and some other world powers have reached the same state of the art that, of course, they have. So now we have what we call a Mexican standoff. They're pretty much isolated, doing their own thing, and we're doing our own thing. So it's no longer a threat. The threat, of course, if is to be one, is the subversion of yours and my consciousness. You know, this is why I came in with at the very beginning and tried to impress upon your minds that the only solution to any and all of this is spiritual in nature. If we buy into the very things that I've been telling you, which is just part of a tap dance, you know, I could in 5 minutes I could give you everything you need to know and walk out of here, and you would be just as well off as you were listening to me for 4 hours. So people like entertainment, and of course I'm here to entertain. At the same time, to educate you in terms of what's happening in the world. The bottom line to any and all of the things that I'm telling you is to live your own truth, to walk your own talk, to walk in love and light and balance. And if you do those things, all else will take care of itself. And I always end up with that, and I will again today. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, of course, the scenario to that was, as I said, Hitler, of course, lived out a normal lifespan and died a natural age. And again, he was an instrument, divine in nature. And if you stop and think about the Second World War, a lot of good things have come out of the Second World War. Certainly, it was to teach us never to war again. There never will be, as you will find out tomorrow. For instance, in the Hopi prophecy and some of the Indian prophecy I'll give you, there is not another major war destined to be. There will not be one. First of all, the powers who overlight us, I didn't say overshadow, but I said overlight us, will not permit a third world war, because this planet cannot be destroyed, because it is an integral, essential part of the graduation ceremony. All of our sister planets and brother planets are waiting for us. We must make it this time at all costs. They will allow us to err, if you will, up to a point. But when it comes to the point it looks like we're going to destroy the planet itself, they will intervene. They will interfere with our free will, because we've gone beyond the free will limitations, you see. Now, in truth, there is no such thing, believe it or not, as free will. We say there is, but there is not. There is free will to a limit. If, and I use this blackboard illustratively, if we stay within the confines of this blackboard, we have free will. But if we stray outside of the confines of this blackboard or whiteboard, we'll get zapped, you know. So Have a question back there? Oh, okay. So free will, I'm saying to you, has its limitations. Within our realm and arena of understanding, there is such a thing as free will. But if we go beyond, it's just like the Garden of Eden, you know. As long as Adam and Eve agreed to the original principles and precepts and so forth, there was free will and everything was hunky-dory. But when they violated that, they were kicked out of the garden. And of course, we know what happens historically since then. Okay. Any other questions? Now, okay, we were talking about wormwood, weren't we? We want to talk about that briefly. So let me spend the next 20 minutes, if you will. If there's no more questions, I will spend this on wormwood. Yes?
Well, you're going to expound a little bit more on your own personal transformation from your...
Well, there's not much really that I can say about my personal experience. There was a shift in consciousness which came through the arising of my Kundalini. And what I say about that even today, I don't fully understand it. I say facetiously, I say today I is and yesterday I are. You know, I don't know. I don't think anybody fully understands the Kundalini, other than it is an energy which is in all of us, which in due time, sooner or later, will come up in all of us. It's located at the base of the spine. It's in a coiled fashion. In fact, it's called the serpentine energy. It's coiled up like a snake in a very tight ball. And at a given moment or given time, when appropriate, it can be unleashed. And what happens is at that point, it begins to open up like this. And then, of course, it travels up the spine and through the individualistic chakras until, of course, it reaches the crown chakra. And you receive, you might say, the Christ consciousness, which gives you the great awareness and perception. In other words, you're clairvoyant, such as I am, or psychic, call it what you will. You have all the gifts that you once had, you see, and you can use them for the betterment of self and also for the betterment of mankind. There's two ways for the Kundalini to come up. There's a proper way, which of course should be under the direction and guidance of someone who understands it and has had the experience themselves, or it can come up just all of a sudden, and most times that is fatal. Mine was near fatal. And the things that happened to me, I wouldn't wish upon anybody else. One of the attributes that goes with it that is at first very exciting is that you have unlimited sexual prowess, you know. And the fact of the matter is you walk around with a perpetual erection 24 hours a day, and there's no satiating it. Now that sounds like fun. Initially it might be, but I'll tell you what, it becomes a nightmare. Particularly when you're a businessman, as I was, one who was on call for the whole state of Florida. And I'm going through these energies and in a high state of excitation and what have you. It basically ruined my marriage, for one thing, and caused a lot of other problems. It gave me, when it came up, it scalded me inside. And my intestines were totally scalded. For instance, if I eat any food that had substance to it, the linings of my intestines were so soft and flaccid that objects such as nuts and pieces of salad and so forth would actually anchor on the intestines, the inside. Then they would heal over, and then they become ulcerous, and then they would become, what do you call it? Well, poisonous. There's a word for it. I can't think of it. Putrefied is one. Yeah, that's a word for it too, but it's a medical word for it. I can't think of it right now, but nonetheless, it breaks. Then those toxins go into the system, and of course, it poisons the whole system. It's like it'd be equivalent to a appendicitis attack. That you know, it breaks, and then you're living with it. Then it becomes abnormal, and it could kill you because of the acids and the poisons within it. That's what happened to my stomach, and it was an effort for me to walk, because every step is excruciating. I would actually have tears in my eyes, and I was in constant pain. I fought it. For instance, what I did, I would go out at night after work, and I would run. And for the first mile, I cried. I mean, physically cried and anguished, and in some cases screamed. As I got into the second mile, I began to relieve it a bit, you know, and I could feel more comfortable with it. And that's actually what I did. I forced myself through it. I ran myself out of it until eventually it got to an acceptable state. But it was a woman who came to visit me in Tampa, Florida, who put me on the spiritual path, a woman by the name of Reverend Peggy York, who was told in Sacramento, California, there was a man to be found on the East Coast, and that she was to go find him, and she was to put him on the path because he had works to do here on the planet. That guy was me. And I had a reading with her, one against my reluctance was terrible with her, but Spirit saw that I finally had a reading with her. And what was supposed to be a 20-minute reading lasted 5.5 hours. And she, all of a sudden, we took a break, and she looked over my head, and she pointed, and she says, they tell me you have a very bad stomach. What happened? And I said, well, my Kundalini came up and did all this and that to me. She says, well, they tell me you're to eat grass. And I laughed. I said, yeah, I eat grass like a cow, you mean? She says, no, dummy. You go to the health food store and you get alfalfa tablets and start taking those, and they will clean up and heal the intestines. And that's what I did. I went and got alfalfa tablets, and within, I would say, 6 weeks, I'm back on a regular regime of and diet of food and begin to get better. Do you have a question, Michael?
What do we have to do as far as being able to protect ourselves from different entities?
You know, Michael, at this time that we're in, it is a constant thing that you must practice and realize. I protect myself when I get up in the morning. I protect myself when I go to bed at night with my prayers and all things. Any moment that I get into a situation in this life now that is unfavorable to me, I immediately put the light around myself and protect myself. We must do that because the forces of darkness, even though they're a part of us, they are trying to circumvent us and keep us from coming into our natural beingness and state. And it's a good question, because I put this out to you too. I don't care how advanced you are. In fact, sometimes the more advanced you are, the more vulnerable you are. And the more they want to target you to wipe you out, you know. So it's a constant duty and attention thing to keep yourself protected at all times. Yes, thank you, Michael, for asking that question. So in terms, going back to you and the Kundalini, Peggy's the one who told me to go on to eat grass as my Indian. Incidentally, that came from my Indian guides. There were 6 of them standing behind me. And in the initial, I have to tell you the whole story. In the initial presentation, I heard this woman was coming to town in Tampa, Florida, and she was a renowned psychometrist. You know what a psychometrist is? Okay. She was renowned. I mean renowned. She could take any object, put it up to her third eye, and she would give you your life's history. And what happened was she rented a ballroom in this hotel in Tampa. There were 350 people in there. And she had a stage like this, a set of steps here and a set of steps here, and they would come up to her and cross in front of her, and she'd take an object and put it up to her third eye and give them an instantaneous reading. And boy, they were right on. In one case, a man came up and he took his pen out and he handed it to her. She put up to her third eye and she says, oh, I see you're having an affair with your secretary. And his wife was in the audience. And then something happened to another woman, and her spouse was in the audience. She fainted. That woman fainted. And then there was a big secret deal industrially taking place in the Tampa Bay area. And this dummy got up there and gave her his watch, you know, and she says, oh, I see you closed the so-and-so deal. And it was totally secret, but she exposed the whole thing right then and there. But just before that, she had with her as an opening shot what they call a Kundalini healer. Never seen one since, and I don't want to really see one. He could use his hands. He could actually affect the Kundalini of the person sitting in front of him. He would get within the proximity of the person. He would put his hands in the aura of the person. And it's like you see people in hypnosis, you know, he can move them back and forth or bark like a dog or whatever, although he didn't do that. He had the person, though, under his total control. The minute that he touched the aura of the person went like this and was out. and then he could take his hand, and as he would pull away from them, their body would go forward with him. As he pushed, they would go back. He controlled them through the energy field, theirs and his, to do what he wanted. Then I heard some damn fool say, "You can't do that to me." And when I looked around to see who it was me. And I was standing up. And I realized that I had said it, and I was standing up, and every head swung to me, and I didn't know what to do. And before I could make a decision, he said, "Young man, get up here." And I did go up. And so what happened was he tried to do it to me, and he couldn't. Just as I said, he couldn't put me under. But my God, the power that man had in his hands, as he would pull his hands through my aura, I could feel everything. I could feel the blood actually being pulled in his veins, you know, and the energy field that he was pulling on. People later told me that my face was as red as his shirt. It was just beet red, and especially when he brought the energy up around here, you see. So you can imagine what was happening to the rest of my body. What finally happened is he collapsed in exhaustion, and I was totally enervated myself. But he said to me, he said, "You're right, I can't do it to you." Peggy, at that point, the one who put me on the path, she said she knew right then and then that I was the man she was looking for. And then later on, she told me that when that happened, these 6 Indian guides I have were the ones who put me up to it. And they were hilarious because I had stood up and made this so-called mistake. But again, it was that experience, the Kundalini experience, and Peggy York and so forth that put me on the path. And that was in 1971 or somewhere around there. So I have to say to you and everybody in here, I did not get here willingly. I got here kicking and screaming. I really did. And to me, it was a bunch of hooey, being an old retired military man, a government man, a businessman, and all that. I fought it all the way. I was not about to be seduced into this whole affair, but gradually I was, and of course, thank God today that I did finally listen and take it to myself, and of course it's been my life ever since. Okay, now let's quickly, yes dear?
Virgil, I know that it's getting toward the end of the day. I would love to hear you talk more about how we can protect ourselves from abductions and from some of the stuff that's going on, you know, wherever we are. Is there a ritual, or is there something specific that we need to be aware of that will help us be protected?
Well, the simplest thing is, as I said, to cover yourself with the light. Be one with God. And if you are one with God, and you can visualize the light around yourself, or love, or whatever, then you're not vulnerable.
You said that I were talking about a talk about this lady that there were 3 things that you had decided that they came towards you, if the Greys tried to come abduct you, that would make them go away from you?
Yes, I can give you that. That's it's an affirmation which you make, which protects you from being abducted, or in the process of being abducted, you can stop them from doing these terrible things to you. It's 3 basic things, and I don't take credit for this. This comes from a woman who actually experienced this and performed it in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was taken out of her bed, and she was taken aboard this craft, and like all other abductees, they were about to put her on the table and to examine her. And for women, it's much more horrendous than it is for men. You know, the things they do to women is terrible. But just as they began they disrobed her, and at that point, she spoke out, and she came out with the most remarkable thing, in my opinion, and I've used it ever since to help people around the world. She said simply this. She said, "Stop." Right away, "Stop." Now, these were the little Greys she was talking to. "What you're doing is in violation of my free will." I'm putting up here on the board for you. So the first thing, she said, "Stop." Then she said, "What you're doing is against or interfering with my free will." So we'll put just free will. Number 2, she said, "What you're doing is in violation of the Christ principle." Christ principle. 3, she said, "And what you are doing is in violation of universal law. So, universal law. Now, here's the kicker to the whole thing, and really threw him into a panic. Stopped, panicked him, and then she said, if you don't believe so, go ask your masters. There was the clincher. She said all three of these things, and she says, now, if you don't believe what I said, that this is true, go ask your masters. So then the final thing that you say is, go ask your masters. All right, now I already told you that their masters are humanoid in nature. At that point, she threw this courtier of grays into a whole state of excitement and disorder. You know, and so finally it was agreed that two of them would peel off and go back to the masters and get an answer to this. Two of them went into the ship and lost themselves, and after a couple of minutes, or maybe 5 minutes or so, they came back. And they said, the master said, she's right, let her go. She had exercised her authority, she had exercised her godship through these commitments that she made here, and she had the intelligence and the perception and foresight enough to know that none of this would amount to anything unless it was to be decreed by the masters. So when the masters realized that she was of the light and she was perceptive enough to know the truth, they said, let her go. And she was taken back into her bed and released and hasn't been harmed since then. Now, I've used this myself on several occasions, and believe me, it will work. So if you want to put it in your memory, free will, Christ principle, and universal law, begin with stop, end it up. If you don't believe so, go ask your masters. And it works.
I've also heard it, I'm sorry I don't remember, that there are three sacred names you can call out that
Yes.
falls not only in space, not only extraterrestrial, but in each one of evil that you're confronted with.
Well,
I don't remember the name.
you see, there it is. Now that's the point I want to bring out. Why make it complicated? It reminds me of a time that I was attacked by an old sorcerer. You know, I've worked with the Indians now for 23 years. And in my early days, I got in some tough times. And one of them was down here in the Papagos Reservation with a very evil man, a sorcerer by the name of Juan Francisco. And don't ever doubt the powers, I'll be talking about it tomorrow in my Indian presentation, the power of the mind, particularly as applied by the Indians. This old bugger had me before I knew what to do. He was inside of me and he was controlling me. And I was trying to think of all the things I could say to break his energy like you were doing, you know. You know what? I came up against a blank wall. I couldn't think of anything, and I was near a state of panic. And finally, I said, well, one of my favorite sayings, even before I was about to die in combat or something like that, you know, I've got one favorite thing is, oh, shit, you know. and somehow or other, it breaks the energy. There's something sacred about saying that. I'm not kidding you. Do you know that, for instance, when they recover the little black boxes, that the most common comment on there is, oh, shit? Yeah. So why it is so, I don't know. But when I did that, I broke that energy, that panic state I was in, you know, and I said, you damn fool. I said to myself, you damn fool, all you have to do is cover yourself with the light, with God's light, and the rest will take care of itself. And when I did that, I broke his energy, and he turned around and he smiled at me because he was ignoring me. He was attacking me through it was getting dark, and he was attacking me through the glass of the car, which now was mirror-like. He was getting me through that. And he turned around and grinned at me, acknowledging that I had broken his energy and power, you know. Later on, we really got into a real Donnybrook, you know. And tomorrow I'll talk about it. But the thing I'm trying to say to you and anybody listening to this video or in this audience today, for God's sakes, keep it simple. K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, sunshine, you know. Now, in the military, we didn't say that. We used to say K-I-S-S was keep it simple, stupid. So the more we think of mantras, the more we think of affirmations, the more we complicate things, the less effective we are. If you can just be one with God, that's why I impressed upon you in the very early part of this, to have in your conscience, to be one with God, to walk in love and light and balance, that takes care of it all, you know. You don't have to be a Rosicrucian. You don't have to be a Mason. You don't have to be any of those brotherhoods to be important or to protect yourself in the event of these catastrophes that might happen, you see. So when you come up against something like that, just cover yourself with the light and say, thine will be done. The rest will take care of itself. This is what I do. And I'll tell you, I've been in horrendous situations as a spiritual warrior. Some that you wouldn't believe I walked away from. That was the power I used, you know. Yes?
I'm really curious about what's happened in Sedona and around here.
Well, I don't think this is the time and the place to go into it. I will tell you this much, as I said earlier, there are some things going on which are very uncommon in nature. They are extraterrestrially oriented. They do involve the United States government and militarily and what have you. And these are things that are not only taking place here, but throughout the whole southwest United States. Bill Cooper, in his book, Beware a Pale Horse, and many of the other publications that are out, they deal with this phenomena in depth, and all of it is gloom doom. Some of it is reality, as I said. And it is a reality only so far as that which we have created for ourselves. All of this, Dulce, Groom 51, Sedona, or any other area that has this very aberrant energy, in other words, our involvement with the bad ETs, all of that is illusionary. The only real truth, the only real thing that you have to hang on to is that divine spark within you and love. And if you can believe in that and let the rest of this stuff take care of itself, then you will be safe in the future in terms of what is about to happen to any and all of us. If you buy into the fear, if you buy into the control, and let these things affect you and take your power away, you're going to be one of them rather than one of the incoming consciousness. So I say to you, be aware that these things are happening, but don't get involved in them. Don't give them your power, because that's what so many are doing. It's just like the earth changes. We're giving our power away. It's like these scary things we hear about the government and Dulce and Groom 51, where we know that we're actually committed to working with the extraterrestrials, biological research, and many other hideous things which are going on, 7 different levels that are involved. If we do that and we dwell there, then again we lose our power. Responsible for your journey here on earth. None other. God loves you. God doesn't care whether you sit on that chair or you sit on the floor. God doesn't care whether you're rich or you're poor. Makes no difference to him. The only thing that the source, the creator, what matters to him is you don't forget her or him or it, the creator. All else is illusion. All else is fun and games. All else was created for you experientially to grow, to experience these things, solve the riddle of the moment, rise above it, and go on to the next level of consciousness. And that's what it's all about. And there's many in this audience, if not all of you right now, who are reaching for that ultimate final step before you cross over from the 3rd dimension into the 4th and the 5th. Only you know where you are. If you can take to heart some of the simple things I said today, you are assured to be part of the graduation ceremony. There's a tape back there called the Cosmic Express. It's the most popular tape I have. I cut it, I think, in 1979 or 1980. And that little thing is profound. And I don't know, back in those days, it was too complicated for people to comprehend. Today, the consciousness level, of course, is much higher. Now, 12 years later, and people are beginning to understand it or can understand it. And it's become a very popular tape.